A single dead bee. That's all it took to unravel what should have been the perfect crime. On a quiet Tuesday morning in Austin, Texas, a mother was brutally murdered in her backyard, surrounded by the bees she'd lovingly cared for over 14 years. Her teenage son had an airtight alibi. He was 40 miles away. His phone records proved it. Witnesses confirmed it. There was no way he could have been at the scene. But Detective Indigo Garcia noticed something impossibly small, something that would turn cutting-edge forensic science into a murder weapon itself. A creature so tiny, most investigators would have missed it entirely, stuck to the sole of a 17-year-old's shoe. What followed was a case that would horrify a community, destroy a police chief's family from within, and force a courtroom to confront a chilling question. How does online radicalization transform a normal teenager into someone capable of matricide? This is the story of how a honeybee brought justice to Thessalie Harris and exposed the darkest corners of the internet. Before we dive into this devastating story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button if you're finding this case as compelling as I do. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. It genuinely helps us understand our community and bring you more stories like this. Now, let's get into the horror that unfolded in that Austin backyard. March 22nd, 2022. Austin, Texas. The kind of Tuesday morning where the air still carries that crisp coolness before the sun really gets to work. For most people in the neighborhood, it was just another ordinary day. Coffee brewing, kids getting ready for school, the rhythmic hum of suburban life doing what it does best, continuing on, predictable and safe. But in one backyard, surrounded by wooden hive boxes painted in cheerful colors, something unspeakable had just happened. Thessalie Harris lay motionless between hives number 7 and 8, her own meticulous labeling system ensuring that even in death, her organizational precision remained evident. A bloodied garden rock, about the size of a softball, rested 4 feet from her head. The medical examiner would later determine she'd been struck 7 times. 7. The first blow had been enough to cause immediate unconsciousness, meaning every strike after that was pure, unfiltered rage. Around her, thousands of bees swarmed in frantic, disoriented patterns. Their ordered world had been shattered just as violently as the Corwin families had been that morning. These weren't just any bees. They were Carniolan honeybees, a specific breed that Thessalie had carefully cultivated over 14 years. She'd built this apiary from absolutely nothing, transforming a patch of backyard into a thriving ecosystem that produced award-winning honey she generously shared with neighbors and donated to local food banks. To Thessalie, beekeeping wasn't just a hobby. It was meditation, connection, purpose. And now, it was her crime scene. Standing at the edge of this nightmare was Chief Stellan Corwin, a 23-year veteran of the Austin Police Department. Imagine that for a moment. 2 decades of training, thousands of crime scenes, countless hours of learning to compartmentalize, to separate the professional from the personal, to view tragedy through the lens of procedure rather than emotion. All of that experience, all of that carefully constructed detachment, meant absolutely nothing in this moment. Because this wasn't just another victim. This was Thessalie, the woman who'd stood by him through the darkest period of his life after his brother's suicide. The woman who'd raised their 2 children while he worked impossible hours, who'd somehow managed to build a career as a forensic accountant while maintaining a home and cultivating her beloved apiary. His hands shook as he pulled out his phone to call 911, his voice breaking as he reported his own address, a location he'd driven past hundreds of times while responding to other people's tragedies. Now it was his tragedy, his address, his wife, and he was about to become both witness and victim in a case that would eventually destroy everything he thought he knew about his family. The responding officers found Chief Corwin sitting on the back porch steps, still in his uniform, his service weapon secured, but his face completely vacant with shock. There's a particular kind of emptiness that takes over when the human brain simply cannot process what it's experiencing, and every officer who arrived at that scene could see it written across their chief's face. Detective Indigo Garcia arrived within 18 minutes of the initial call. At 34 years old, she'd already built a reputation in the department's homicide division, 9 years of experience, 31 cases closed out of 33 assigned. She was sharp, methodical, and possessed that rare quality every great detective needs, the ability to notice what others don't. But even with all her experience, Approaching this particular crime scene required a delicate balance she'd never quite encountered before. How do you investigate a murder when the victim is married to your commanding officer? How do you ask the necessary questions without causing additional pain? How do you maintain professional detachment when the grief in front of you is so raw, so immediate, that it feels almost invasive to be there at all? Garcia approached Stellan with the careful diplomacy of someone walking a tightrope between colleague and investigator. She asked him to walk her through his morning while crime scene technicians began their methodical documentation of every detail. His story was straightforward, almost painfully so. He'd left for work at 6:30 that morning, attended a budget meeting that mercifully got cut short because the city manager had fallen ill, and returned home to find his entire world irrevocably shattered. His alibi was ironclad. His grief was undeniable. But even as Garcia listened with genuine sympathy, her trained instincts were already cataloging details, noting the positions of things, calculating timelines, building the framework of what would eventually become one of Austin's most haunting cases. Because here's the thing about homicide investigations that most people don't fully grasp. The first few hours are absolutely critical. Evidence degrades. Memories become unreliable. Witnesses disappear. Every minute that passes makes the case exponentially harder to solve. So even while Garcia's human heart ached for Chief Corwin, her detective's brain was already working, already assembling the pieces of a puzzle she couldn't yet see the full picture of. The crime scene itself told a story of sudden, explosive violence that seemed completely at odds with the peaceful suburban setting. Blood spatter patterns indicated the attack had been brutally efficient, the kind of violence that speaks to either complete loss of control or, paradoxically, a calculated determination to ensure the victim couldn't survive. The rock used as the murder weapon had come from the garden bed nearby, suggesting this wasn't premeditated in the sense of bringing a weapon to the scene, but it also wasn't entirely spontaneous. Someone had to pick up that rock. Someone had to make the conscious decision to strike, and then strike again, and again, and again, 7 times total. Within the hour, the Corwin children were located, and their reactions would offer the first hints of fractured family dynamics that would later prove absolutely central to the case. Merritt Corwin, 20 years old, was found at the University of Texas Library where campus security confirmed she'd been studying since 8 in the morning. Her library card access records and surveillance footage provided absolute verification, the kind of alibi that leaves zero room for doubt. But when officers informed her of her mother's death, Merritt's immediate response struck them as odd. She asked, "Did she suffer?" Now, on the surface, that's a natural question. But it was the way she asked it, the subtle inflection, the tone, that made Detective Garcia noted in her initial report. It seemed less like concern and more like hope, as though Merritt wanted confirmation of her mother's pain. The relationship between Merritt and Thessalie had been strained for months, ever since a confrontation about money that neighbors had actually overheard through the Corwins' open windows one humid September night. Financial disagreements in families aren't unusual, but there was clearly something deeper festering beneath the surface of this mother-daughter relationship. Then there was Breck Miller, 17 years old, who presented an entirely different scenario when investigators attempted to locate him. He'd told his father the previous evening that he'd be spending the night at his girlfriend's house in Round Rock, a suburb approximately 40 miles north of Austin. When Detective Garcia and her partner made the drive to Round Rock to deliver the news in person, because you always deliver death notifications face-to-face when possible, they found Breck in the living room of the Yates family home, playing video games with what appeared to be genuine relaxation. Phone records confirmed he'd been texting from that location throughout the morning. The girlfriend's mother, Sandra Yates, verified that Breck had arrived around 9 o'clock the previous night and had been in the house all morning. Everything checked out. Everything made sense. His reaction to hearing about his mother's death seemed appropriate, if perhaps somewhat muted. Tears, shock, the stammered questions of a teenage boy struggling to process sudden, violent loss. But Detective Indigo Garcia hadn't risen through the ranks of Austin PD's homicide division by accepting surface appearances. She was the daughter of immigrants who'd taught her to notice what people didn't say as much as what they did. As she sat across from Breck in that living room, asking gentle questions about when he'd last seen his mother, what their relationship had been like, whether he'd noticed anything unusual recently, She observed his body language with the intensity that had closed 31 of her 33 assigned cases. His hands were steady. His breathing was regular. There were tears, yes, but there was something in his eyes that didn't quite match those tears, a calculation, a watchfulness, as if he were performing grief rather than genuinely experiencing it. It's difficult to articulate exactly what triggers a detective's instincts in moments like these. It's not any single thing, not a specific gesture or word or expression. It's the accumulation of tiny inconsistencies, the way puzzle pieces almost fit, but not quite, the sense that you're watching someone play a role they've rehearsed. And then, as Breck stood to use the bathroom, Detective Garcia's eyes tracked his movements with professional precision. That's when she saw it. On the sole of Breck's right sneaker, embedded in the tread pattern near the ball of his foot, was a single dead honeybee. The insect was small, barely noticeable, the kind of thing 100 investigators might have missed entirely. Its body was crushed but intact enough that Garcia could make out the distinctive, fuzzy thorax and striped abdomen. In that moment, sitting in a stranger's living room 40 miles from the crime scene, Detective Indigo Garcia felt the electric jolt of instinct that every investigator lives for. The moment when seemingly random details suddenly align into pattern, when chaos resolves into clarity. Thessalie Harris had been killed in her apiary, surrounded by thousands of bees. And her son, who supposedly hadn't been home, who had an airtight alibi 40 miles away, had a bee embedded in his shoe. Think about the odds of that for a second. Really think about it. It was March in Texas, still too cool for bees to be commonly buzzing around suburban yards. And this wasn't just any bee. Garcia's years of listening to Thessalie talk about her apiary at department social functions told her this looked like one of those special carniolan bees Thessalie had been so proud of cultivating. The probability of this being coincidental was astronomical. But Garcia maintained her composure with the discipline her training had drilled into her. She continued the interview with Breck as though she'd noticed absolutely nothing unusual, asking about his relationship with his mother, about his plans for the future, about whether he'd seen or heard anything suspicious in recent days. Breck's answers were consistent, almost practiced, painting a picture of a normal teenage boy with a normal life and a loving, if sometimes strict, mother. But Garcia was no longer listening to his words with full attention. She was watching his feet, noting how he kept them tucked under the couch, perhaps unconsciously aware of the evidence he carried. When she finally stood to leave, she asked Breck if he'd be willing to come to the station later to provide a formal statement, framing it as routine procedure for immediate family members. He agreed readily, perhaps too readily, confirming her growing suspicion that he believed himself untouchable behind his 40-mile alibi. The drive back to Austin gave Garcia time to think, to begin constructing the framework of a theory that seemed impossible yet increasingly undeniable. If Breck had been at his mother's house that morning, he would have needed to drive 40 miles south, commit the murder, and drive 40 miles back north, all within a window that his phone records and Sandra Yates's testimony seemed to contradict. Yet that bee wasn't the kind of evidence that appeared randomly. Carniolan bees, if that's what it actually was, weren't native to Texas and were relatively rare, even among hobbyist beekeepers. Thessalie's hives were registered with the state agriculture department as purebred carniolan stock, a detail Garcia had noted from the initial crime scene assessment. The probability of Breck stepping on a carniolan bee anywhere other than his mother's property was infinitesimally small. It was the kind of detail that could crack a case wide open, if the science backed it up. Back at Austin PD headquarters, Garcia immediately submitted a request for expedited forensic analysis of the bee, carefully removing it from Breck's shoe during what she framed as routine, consensual evidence collection. The crime scene technicians had already collected dozens of dead bees from around Thessalie's body, and Garcia wanted comparison analysis to determine if the bee from Breck's shoe matched the genetic profile of Thessalie's hives. She also requested comprehensive phone data analysis, not just the text messages Breck had sent, but the cell tower pings that would show his phone's actual physical location throughout the morning. Technology had advanced to the point where investigators could track a phone's movement with remarkable precision, and Garcia suspected that Breck's phone might tell a very different story than his alibi suggested. As the sun set on that terrible Tuesday, Detective Garcia sat in her office surrounded by preliminary crime scene photos, witness statements, and the tiny evidence container holding a single dead honeybee. She didn't know it yet, but that bee would become the most important piece of forensic evidence in Texas criminal history. It would unlock a case that seemed perfect, expose a conspiracy of one, and reveal a depth of planning and callousness that would eventually prompt a judge to call this the worst case I've seen. But that was all still ahead. For now, Garcia had a dead bee, a gut instinct, and the beginning of a theory that would either make her career or make her look foolish. The science would tell the story. It always did. 40 miles. That's the distance between Austin and Round Rock, Texas. In normal traffic, it's about a 45-minute drive. During rush hour, maybe an hour. But in the context of a murder investigation, 40 miles might as well be 400. It's the kind of distance that creates reasonable doubt, that makes juries pause, that gives defense attorneys something concrete to work with. And Breck Miller's alibi wasn't just 40 miles away. It was airtight, verified, seemingly unbreakable. Or at least, that's what everyone thought before a dead bee changed everything. Let's reconstruct what investigators initially believed happened on the morning of March 22, 2022, based on the evidence they had before Detective Garcia's crucial observation. According to Breck's own account, backed up by multiple forms of verification, he'd arrived at his girlfriend's house in Round Rock around 9 o'clock on the evening of March 21st. Sandra Yates, the girlfriend's mother, confirmed this timing. She remembered because she'd been watching her favorite television show when Breck arrived, and she'd paused it to greet him at the door. Her daughter, we'll call her Emma, though that's not her real name for privacy reasons, had been dating Breck for about 3 months, and Sandra had gotten comfortable with him spending occasional nights at their house. He seemed like a polite, well-mannered kid. A little quiet maybe, but nothing that raised any red flags. The evening had been unremarkable. Breck and Emma had watched movies in the living room, eaten popcorn, talked about typical teenage things, school, friends, plans for the upcoming summer. Sandra had gone to bed around 11, leaving the teenagers with standard instructions about keeping the noise down and not staying up too late. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly what you'd expect from a typical teenage sleepover. The next morning, Sandra had gotten up at 6:30 to prepare for her nursing shift that started at 8. She'd seen Breck asleep on the couch in the living room, exactly where she'd expected him to be. Emma was still asleep in her room upstairs. Sandra had made coffee, gotten ready for work, and left the house at 7:15, confident that both teenagers were safely tucked away and likely to sleep until mid-morning, as teenagers do. She had absolutely no reason to believe anything unusual was happening. And here's where the alibi gets really interesting, really solid, the kind of solid that makes prosecutors nervous and defense attorneys smile. Throughout the morning of March 22nd, Breck's phone was actively pinging off cell towers in the Round Rock area. Not just sitting idle, but actually being used. Text messages were being sent to friends, typical teenage communication, memes, jokes, casual conversation. At 9:17 a.m., he texted a buddy about a video game they'd been playing. At 9:43 a.m., he responded to a group chat with his school friends. At 10:28 a.m., he sent Emma a message even though she was upstairs in her own house, asking if she was awake yet. Every single one of these messages originated from cell towers in Round Rock, creating a digital trail that placed him exactly where he said he was. Cell phone data doesn't lie, right? It's one of the most reliable forms of evidence in modern investigations. When a phone pings a tower, that's because the phone is physically within range of that tower. It's not something you can fake easily. It's not subjective like eyewitness testimony. It's cold, hard technological fact. But Detective Garcia wasn't satisfied. There was something about Breck's demeanor during that interview, something about the way he'd reacted to news of his mother's death. And of course, there was that damn bee. So she started digging deeper, asking questions that went beyond the surface-level verification of the alibi. She requested not just the cell tower data, but the full forensic analysis of Breck's phone activity. She wanted to know not just where the phone was, but exactly how it was being used. Were the text messages typed manually in real time, or were they scheduled? Was there any pattern to the activity that seemed unusual? She also requested something that would prove absolutely critical: access to the Yates family's Ring doorbell camera footage. Sandra Yates had mentioned in her initial interview that they had a video doorbell, one of those smart home security devices that records everyone who approaches the front door. It was a small detail, almost throwaway information, But Garcia had learned over her 9 years in homicide that small details often crack big cases. Meanwhile, the forensic analysis of Breck's phone was revealing something that would fundamentally change the investigation. The technical team at Austin PD, working with specialists from the Texas Rangers Cybercrimes Unit, discovered that while Breck's phone had indeed been in Round Rock all morning, the text messages he'd sent weren't quite what they appeared to be. They were scheduled messages. Now, scheduled messaging is a completely normal feature on modern smartphones. Teenagers use it all the time, setting up texts to send while they're sleeping so they seem responsive, scheduling birthday messages, that sort of thing. It's not inherently suspicious. But in the context of a murder investigation, in the context of a teenager with an airtight alibi, scheduled messages take on an entirely different meaning. Because if you can schedule your phone to send messages while you're not actually with your phone, suddenly that airtight alibi develops some significant cracks. The technical analysis showed that all of Breck's text messages from the morning of March 22nd had been set up the night before, scheduled to send at specific times to create the appearance of normal, real-time activity. It was actually quite sophisticated for a 17-year-old, the kind of planning that required technical knowledge and forethought. He'd spaced the messages out naturally, not in suspiciously regular intervals, but in the random pattern of genuine teenage communication. If the investigation had relied solely on text message timestamps without deep forensic analysis, this deception would have worked perfectly. But technology is a double-edged sword. The same digital systems that can create an alibi can also expose one when examined closely enough. And then came the Ring doorbell footage, which told an even more damning story. Sandra Yates had been completely truthful when she said Breck had arrived at 9 o'clock the previous evening and was at the house the next morning. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, was what happened in between. The Ring camera at the front door showed Breck arriving at 9:03 p.m. on March 21st, exactly as Sandra had described. But the Yates family had a back door too, leading to their small backyard, and while they didn't have a camera on that door, its existence would prove crucial to understanding what really happened. The front door camera showed no one leaving or arriving after Breck's initial entrance at 9:03 p.m. If investigators had only checked the front door footage, the alibi would have held. But Detective Garcia requested access to the neighboring property's security cameras as well, and one neighbor had a camera that captured a partial view of the Yates backyard. That footage showed something Sandra Yates never saw, something that would dismantle Breck's perfect alibi piece by piece. At 8:47 a.m. on March 22nd, a figure matching Breck's build and clothing exited through the back door of the Yates house and walked to a car parked on the street behind their property, not directly in front of the house where it might be noticed, but one street over, accessible through the backyard. The figure got into the car and drove away. The camera angle wasn't perfect. You couldn't see the person's face clearly enough for a definitive identification, but the timeline was damning. At 11:53 a.m., the same figure returned through the same back door. Sandra Yates had already left for her nursing shift at 11:30 a.m., meaning there was no one home to notice Breck's absence. Emma had been asleep upstairs the entire time, having stayed up late the night before and sleeping in as teenagers often do. Neither Sandra nor Emma had any idea that Breck had left the house for over 3 hours. Why would they? His phone was there, sending texts, creating the perfect digital alibi. His belongings were there. When Sandra left for work, he'd appeared to be sleeping on the couch. And when he returned, Emma was still asleep, none the wiser. It was, objectively speaking, a brilliantly constructed plan. For a 17-year-old to think through these details, the scheduled messages, leaving the phone behind, using the back door, parking the car out of sight, demonstrated a level of premeditation that was genuinely chilling. Now came the question that would dominate the investigation. What happened during those 3 hours and 6 minutes when Breck was unaccounted for? The drive from Round Rock to the Corwin house in Austin was approximately 40 miles, taking about 45 minutes in normal traffic. Early morning traffic on a Tuesday would have been lighter than usual. So theoretically, Breck could have left Round Rock at 8:47 a.m., arrived at his family home around 9:30 a.m., committed the murder, and driven back to Round Rock by 11:53 a.m. The timeline worked. It was tight, but it worked. And the medical examiner's determination that Thessalie died between 9:45 a.m. and 10:15 a.m. fit perfectly within that window. But timeline and opportunity weren't enough to build a case. Prosecutors would need physical evidence placing Breck at the scene during that window, not just demonstrating that he could have been there. That's where the bee became absolutely crucial. That tiny insect, crushed beneath Breck's shoe, would need to tell a story that filled in the gaps of what the digital evidence suggested but couldn't definitively prove. Detective Garcia coordinated with the forensic team to build a comprehensive picture of Breck's movements. They pulled traffic camera footage from the route between Round Rock and Austin, looking for Breck's car. They found it. Or at least, they found a vehicle matching the description of the car registered to Emma's family that Breck had permission to drive. The traffic cameras showed this vehicle traveling southbound on I-35 at 9:04 a.m., consistent with having left Round Rock shortly after 8:47 a.m. The same vehicle appeared on cameras heading northbound at 11:37 a.m., consistent with returning to Round Rock by 11:53 a.m. The license plate wasn't clearly visible in all the footage. Traffic cameras from 2022 weren't all high definition, but the make, model, and color matched. The circumstantial evidence was piling up, piece by piece, dismantling what had seemed like an unbreakable alibi. But circumstantial evidence, no matter how compelling, can be challenged in court. Defense attorneys could argue coincidence, misidentification, alternative explanations. What prosecutors needed was something irrefutable, something that could survive the scrutiny of cross-examination and reasonable doubt. They needed the science to back up what the timeline suggested. They needed that bee to tell its story. And that's exactly what was happening at the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab in Austin, where Dr. Helena Vasquez was conducting an analysis that would transform forensic entomology from a niche scientific discipline into headline news. Because this wasn't just about proving a bee came from Thessalie's hives. It was about proving exactly when that bee died, what it had been doing in its final hours, and how it ended up on Breck Miller's shoe at the precise moment Detective Garcia saw it. The perfect alibi was crumbling. 40 miles wasn't far enough. Scheduled text messages weren't clever enough. And a single dead bee was about to become the prosecution's most powerful witness. One that couldn't be cross-examined, couldn't be intimidated, couldn't change its story. Science doesn't lie. And science was about to speak very loudly about what happened in that Austin backyard on the morning of March 22, 2022. The bee arrived at the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab on the afternoon of March 23, 2022, sealed in a small evidence container that Detective Garcia had personally delivered. To anyone else, it might have seemed absurd. An entire murder investigation potentially hinging on an insect so small you could barely see it without leaning in close. But Dr. Helena Vasquez, a forensic entomologist with 16 years of experience, received that specimen with the kind of intense focus that Garcia immediately recognized in a fellow specialist. These were two women who understood that justice often lives in the details everyone else overlooks. They'd worked together on 4 previous cases, and Vasquez understood without being told that this tiny creature might be the linchpin of something much larger than itself. Dr. Vasquez began her examination immediately, starting with visual identification under a stereo microscope that magnified the bee's body to 40 times its actual size. Within 11 minutes, she confirmed what Detective Garcia had suspected during that interview in Round Rock. This was indeed a carniolan honeybee, Apis mellifera carnica, distinguished by its grayish-brown coloring and distinctive wing venation pattern that's as unique as a fingerprint to someone trained to read it. But species identification was just the beginning. Dr. Vasquez's analysis would go far deeper, employing techniques that most people don't even realize exist, techniques that would transform this dead insect into a witness more reliable than any human testimony. She carefully dissected the bee's pollen baskets, the specialized structures on its hind legs where bees collect and transport pollen back to the hive. Under high-powered magnification, she found pollen grains from 3 distinct plant species. And then she saw something that made her immediately pick up the phone to call Detective Garcia. The pollen was from Amorphophallus titanum, commonly known as the corpse lily or titanarum. Now, if you're not familiar with this plant, let me paint you a picture. The corpse lily is one of the world's most unusual plants, massive in size, incredibly rare, notoriously difficult to grow, and famous for smelling like rotting flesh when it blooms. It's not the kind of plant you encounter in typical Texas gardens. In fact, it's not the kind of plant you encounter in typical gardens anywhere. These things are so rare that when one blooms at a botanical garden, it makes the news. People travel from across the country to see them. They're that unusual. And according to county agricultural extension records that Garcia pulled within an hour of Dr. Vasquez's call, there was only one registered corpse lily in the entire Austin metropolitan area. 1. It was in Thessalie Harris's garden, located approximately 15 feet from her apiary. Think about what that means for a second. This bee, found on Breck Miller's shoe 40 miles away in Round Rock, was carrying pollen from a plant so rare that there was literally only one of them in the entire region, and that one plant happened to be in the victim's garden. The odds of this being coincidental weren't just low, they were astronomically, impossibly, almost laughably low. But Dr. Vasquez wasn't finished. The forensic evidence grew more damning with each passing hour of analysis. She examined the bee's body for signs of trauma and time of death. Yes, you can determine approximate time of death for insects, using techniques similar to those used for humans, but adapted for their different metabolic processes. She found that the insect had been crushed with force consistent with being stepped on, not swatted or otherwise killed. The compression pattern on the bee's body showed it had been caught between two hard surfaces, a shoe sole and the ground. And the specific angle of compression even suggested the direction of the step. More significantly, Dr. Vasquez analyzed the bee's metabolic state and the progression of cellular breakdown, a technique that allowed her to estimate when the insect had died. This is where forensic entomology becomes almost like science fiction, except it's real, it's admissible in court, and it's remarkably accurate. By examining the degradation of certain enzymes and the presence of specific bacteria that colonize dead insects at predictable rates, Dr. Vasquez determined that the bee had died between 2 and 3.5 hours before Detective Garcia collected it from Breck's shoe at approximately 1:30 p.m. on March 22nd. Working backwards, that meant the bee had died between 10 a.m. and noon. And when you factor in the metabolic rate of carniolan bees in 68-degree weather, yes, temperature matters in these calculations. That window narrowed even further to within 90 minutes of the murder, which the medical examiner had placed between 9:45 a.m. and 10:15 a.m. The bee in Thessalie had died within the same narrow time frame. But Dr. Vasquez still wasn't done. She analyzed the pollen's moisture content and the presence of certain enzymes that degrade over time, techniques so specialized that only a handful of labs in the country could perform them. This analysis revealed that the bee had collected the corpse lily pollen between 9:15 a.m. and 10 a.m. on the morning of March 22nd. The timeline was coming together with the kind of precision that makes prosecutors salivate and defense attorneys nervous. This bee had been alive and actively foraging in Thessalie's garden during the murder window. It had visited the corpse lily, a plant found nowhere else in Austin, multiple times that morning, collecting 47 individual pollen grains. And then it had died, crushed beneath someone's shoe, within 90 minutes of Thessalie's death. Detective Garcia sat in Dr. Vasquez's lab office, reviewing these preliminary findings with the kind of grim satisfaction that comes from watching a theory transform into prosecutable evidence. The bee proved 3 critical facts that no defense attorney could easily explain away. First, Breck had been physically present at his mother's property, not near it, not in the general vicinity, but actually in the apiary where she was killed, close enough to step on one of her bees. Second, he had been there during the murder window, not hours before or after, but during the precise time frame when Thessalie was being bludgeoned to death. Third, he had stepped on one of his mother's bees in the immediate aftermath of the killing, probably while fleeing the scene or during the attack itself when the bees were swarming in agitation. No alternative explanation made sense. Bees don't travel 40 miles north to Round Rock, especially not rare carniolan bees carrying pollen from an equally rare corpse lily that existed in exactly one location in the entire metropolitan area. The evidence was circumstantial in the technical legal sense. There was no video of Breck committing the murder, no eyewitness who'd seen him strike the blows. But it was circumstantial evidence of the most powerful kind, the kind that relies on biology and physics rather than the unreliable nature of human perception and memory. But Detective Garcia knew she needed more. She needed to understand how Breck had created his alibi, how he'd made his phone appear to be in Round Rock while he was actually in Austin committing matricide. That's where the phone data analysis that Garcia's technical team completed on March 24th came in, revealing a level of sophistication that seemed at odds with Breck's age, but perfectly aligned with his generation of digital natives who'd grown up with smartphones as extensions of themselves. The answer was both simple and brilliant. Breck hadn't physically taken his phone to Austin. He'd left it at the Yates house in Round Rock, where it pinged cell towers consistently throughout the morning, creating the perfect digital alibi. But those text messages he'd sent weren't typed in real time as his friends received them. They were scheduled messages, set up the night before, using a feature that millions of teenagers use daily without ever considering its potential applications in committing murder. The sophistication wasn't in the technology itself. Scheduling text messages is remarkably easy, but in the planning, in understanding how investigators would use phone data to verify alibis, in thinking several steps ahead, like a chess player anticipating their opponent's moves. The Ring doorbell footage from the Yates house and their neighbor's security camera filled in the remaining gaps. The timeline was now complete, and it was damning. At 8:47 a.m., Breck had exited through the back door, a route that Sandra Yates never saw because she'd already left for work. He'd walked to a car parked one street over. Not the car in the Yates driveway, but Emma's family car that he had permission to use, parked strategically out of sight. He'd driven 40 miles south to Austin, arriving at his family home around 9:30 a.m. He'd approached through the greenbelt behind the property to avoid being seen by neighbors, entering the backyard through the fence gate. He'd found his mother tending to her hives, as she did every Tuesday morning, following a routine she'd maintained for 14 years. And then he'd attacked her with a rock from the garden bed, striking 7 times with enough force to fracture her skull in 3 places. During the attack, or immediately afterward, he'd stepped on at least one bee as thousands of them swarmed in agitation around their dying keeper and the disrupted hives. Then he'd fled back to his car, driven 40 miles north to Round Rock, and returned through the Yates back door at 11:53 a.m., 23 minutes before Sandra returned home from her nursing shift. The physical evidence from the crime scene supported this reconstruction with multiple corroborating details that would prove crucial at trial. Footprint analysis of the soft soil around the apiary revealed shoe prints consistent with Breck's size 10.5 sneakers, the same shoes from which Detective Garcia had collected the bee. The prints showed a distinctive wear pattern on the right heel that exactly matched Breck's gait, documented through surveillance footage from his school and other locations. More significantly, the prints were fresh, made on the morning of the murder according to moisture analysis of the soil displacement. Weathering patterns on the prints indicated they'd been made between 9:30 a.m. and 10:30 a.m., as determined by the evaporation rate of morning dew in 68-degree weather with 54% humidity. The science was precise enough to eliminate the possibility that the prints had been made at any other time, not the day before, not hours later, but during the murder window. Blood spatter analysis provided additional insights into the violence of the attack and Breck's proximity to his dying mother. The primary blood patterns around Thessalie's body were consistent with blunt force trauma from a rock-like object, with cast-off spatters indicating the weapon was raised and brought down at least 7 times. But there were also transfer patterns, small smears of blood found on the gate latch and on a fence post near the greenbelt access point, suggesting the killer had touched these surfaces with blood on his hands as he fled. DNA analysis of these blood transfers confirmed they came from Thessalie, but they also revealed something else that would prove absolutely critical at trial. Mixed in with the victim's blood were epithelial cells from the person who'd touched the surfaces, skin cells that we all shed constantly without realizing it. The DNA profile from those cells matched Breck Miller with the kind of statistical certainty that makes forensic scientists use terms like exclusion of all other individuals on Earth. The probability that those cells came from anyone other than Breck was approximately 1 in 400 trillion. For context, there are only about 8 billion people on the planet. Armed with this evidence, Detective Garcia obtained a search warrant for Breck's belongings, both at the Yates house and at his father's home in Austin. The search, executed on March 25, 2022, would yield evidence that transformed the case from probable homicide to premeditated murder with chilling ideological undertones. Because what investigators found wasn't just physical evidence of the crime. It was a window into a mind that had been planning this murder for months, documenting every grievance, every perceived slight, every step of the plan that would end with Thessalie Harris lying dead among her beloved bees. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, Detective Garcia had what she needed to make an arrest. She had a dead bee that placed Breck at the scene during the murder window. She had phone data showing the sophisticated construction of a false alibi. She had video footage showing his departure from and return to Round Rock during the critical time frame. She had footprints matching his shoes. She had his DNA mixed with his mother's blood on surfaces he'd touched while fleeing. The science had done what eyewitnesses could not. It had placed Breck Miller at the scene of his mother's murder with the kind of certainty that makes juries comfortable convicting. A single bee, barely visible to the naked eye, had become the most important witness in a murder trial. And unlike human witnesses, it couldn't be cross-examined, couldn't forget crucial details, couldn't be intimidated or confused. It simply was what it was, biological evidence that told an irrefutable story of matricide. In Breck's backpack, hidden in a zippered compartment beneath his school books, investigators found a composition notebook containing 23 pages of handwritten manifesto that detailed his grievances against his mother with the kind of specificity that revealed months of festering resentment. The manifesto was titled The Emasculation of Breck Miller, and it was written in neat print that made its violent content even more disturbing. The careful handwriting of a student completing homework assignments applied to the documentation of plans to commit matricide. When Detective Garcia first read through those pages, sitting in an evidence examination room at Austin PD headquarters, she felt her professional detachment crack in a way it rarely did. She'd investigated dozens of homicides over her 9-year career, had seen the worst of what human beings could do to each other. But there was something uniquely chilling about reading the methodical planning of a 17-year-old plotting to murder his own mother. The manifesto described Thessalie as a controlling matriarch who undermined his masculinity, questioned his judgment, and interfered with his relationship with Luna, the girlfriend he believed was his soulmate and his escape from what he called maternal tyranny. The language throughout the document was clearly borrowed from online spaces that Garcia had encountered in her work, the terminology of men's rights activism taken to its most toxic extreme. He used phrases like beta male subjugation and genocentric control matrix, jargon from forums where young men convinced each other that women, particularly mothers and girlfriends, were engaged in some coordinated campaign to destroy masculine identity. But this wasn't just angry teenage ranting transcribed onto paper. The manifesto revealed planning that went beyond a single murder, detailing Breck's original intention to kill both his mother and his father on March 22, 2022, eliminating what he called the dual-headed monster of parental control. He'd chosen the date because it was exactly 6 months after his 17th birthday, a timeline he believed was symbolically important in establishing his independence, as though turning 17 and a half somehow marked a cosmic shift in his right to autonomy. The plan, as laid out in disturbing detail across those 23 pages, involved waiting for his father to leave for work, killing his mother in the apiary where she worships her insects more than her family, his exact words, then returning at the end of the day to kill his father and stage the scene to look like a murder-suicide. Chief Corwin's unexpected early return home, due to that shortened budget meeting, had forced Breck to improvise, sparing his father's life not out of mercy or second thoughts, but out of pure tactical necessity. The manifesto made this chillingly clear. The old man's early return complicates the timeline. We'll proceed with Phase 1 and reassess Phase 2 based on circumstances. He was talking about murdering his parents with the clinical detachment of someone adjusting a project timeline at work. The manifesto's final entry, dated March 21, 2022, the day before the murder, ended with a phrase that would be quoted in every news article about the case. Tomorrow, the emasculation ends. Tomorrow, I become the master of my own destiny. Reading those words, Detective Garcia understood she wasn't dealing with a crime of passion or a moment of teenage impulsivity. This was premeditated murder, planned over months, documented with the kind of detail that suggested Breck had been rehearsing it mentally long before he actually picked up that garden rock. But the manifesto alone, as damning as it was, raised an obvious question that any defense attorney would seize upon. How much of this was fantasy versus actual intent? Teenagers write dark things all the time. Angry journal entries, violent short stories, disturbing poetry that never translates into action. What made this document evidence of premeditation rather than just the troubled musings of an adolescent mind? The answer came from the digital forensics team's analysis of Breck's laptop, seized during the search warrant execution. The browser history from January and February 2022 painted a picture of someone who wasn't just fantasizing about murder, but actively researching how to accomplish it. The searches were specific, methodical, and deeply troubling. How long do fingerprints last? Had been searched on January 14th. Do police check shoes for evidence on January 29th? Cell phone tracking by police on February 3rd. And perhaps most disturbingly, how to kill someone quickly and quietly on February 17th, just over a month before the murder. These weren't idle curiosity searches. They were reconnaissance, the digital equivalent of a bank robber casing a target before the heist. Breck had also researched his mother's work schedule extensively, pulling up the shared family calendar multiple times to identify when she'd be home alone. He'd studied her routine with the attention to detail you'd expect from a professional hitman, not a teenage son. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, Thessalie spent time in her apiary between 9 and 11 o'clock, tending to her hives before heading to her office for afternoon work. She was consistent, predictable, and during those morning hours, completely alone in the backyard. Breck had identified the perfect window, and he documented his research in a way that left no doubt about his intentions. The digital trail painted a picture of premeditation that undermined any potential defense argument of sudden passion or temporary insanity. This wasn't a teenager who snapped in a moment of anger. This was someone who spent months planning, researching, and preparing to take his mother's life. But perhaps the most revealing digital evidence came from the encrypted messaging apps on Breck's phone, which contained the full record of his relationship with Luna, the relationship that had motivated him to see his mother as an obstacle that needed to be removed. Detective Garcia, in her role as Luna during the undercover operation, had saved every conversation according to the protocols required for such operations, creating a comprehensive record of Breck's progressive radicalization and obsession. The messages showed him sharing his grievances about his mother in increasing detail over the 7 months they'd been in contact, describing her as controlling and emasculating, using language that became progressively more violent as time went on. In early conversations, Breck had complained about his mother's rules, curfews, great expectations, restrictions on his social life. Standard teenage grievances, really, the kind every parent deals with and every teenager resents. But Luna, following the protocols of her undercover role, had asked open-ended questions designed to prompt him to reveal more about his thinking, to potentially expose adults who might be grooming him or involving him in illegal activities. She'd never encouraged violence, never suggested harm, but she'd ask questions like, "How does that make you feel? And what do you think would need to change for you to feel free?" These weren't leading questions in the sense of pushing him toward violence. They were standard rapport-building techniques used in undercover operations. But in Breck's mind, shaped by months of consuming content from incel forums and men's rights websites, Luna's sympathetic ear became validation for his increasingly extreme worldview. The messages showed his thinking evolving from normal teenage frustration to something much darker. In a message from December 2021, he'd written, "Sometimes I think my mom enjoys controlling me, like it gives her some kind of power trip." By February 2022, the language had intensified. "She's systematically destroying my sense of self. Every rule, every criticism, every time she questions my decisions, it's designed to keep me weak." And then, on March 10th, 2022, just 12 days before the murder, he'd written something that would be played for the jury during trial. "Sometimes I think the only way I'll ever be free is if she just wasn't around anymore. Does that make me a terrible person?" It was as close to a confession of intent as the prosecution could hope for, written nearly 2 weeks before he made that dark fantasy a reality. The forensic psychology evaluation of Breck, conducted by Dr. Miranda Chun at the request of the prosecution, provided crucial context for understanding how a seemingly normal teenager could evolve into someone capable of matricide. Dr. Chun, a forensic psychiatrist with 18 years of experience evaluating violent offenders, spent 12 hours interviewing Breck over the course of 4 sessions in April 2022. Her report, filed with the court on May 2nd, described Breck as demonstrating significant narcissistic traits, an external locus of control, meaning he viewed himself as controlled by outside forces rather than responsible for his own choices, and a profound inability to accept responsibility for his actions. Even after his arrest, even when confronted with overwhelming evidence, Breck showed no genuine remorse for killing his mother. Instead, he viewed himself as the victim of her control and the circumstances that had exposed his relationship with Luna. It was a complete inversion of moral responsibility, the psychological equivalent of blaming the lock for catching the thief. Dr. Chin's evaluation concluded that Breck's radicalization in online extremist spaces had provided him with a framework to justify matricide, transforming what should have been normal parental boundaries into perceived persecution worthy of violent response. The incel ideology he'd absorbed over 18 months had taught him to interpret every aspect of his mother's behavior through a lens of gender warfare and emasculation. When Thessalie set a curfew, Breck saw it as maternal oppression. When she questioned his online relationships, he interpreted it as an attack on his masculinity. When she discovered his conversations with Luna and threatened to report them to authorities and have him psychologically evaluated, he viewed it as the ultimate betrayal, an attempt to have him declared mentally incompetent and stripped of his autonomy. In a healthier psychological framework, a teenager might have been angry about these conflicts, might have argued or rebelled in typical adolescent ways. But Breck's framework, shaped by months of consuming content that portrayed mothers as enemies and violence as justified resistance, led him to a very different conclusion, that his mother needed to die for him to be free. The Manifesto revealed just how thoroughly this ideology had taken root in his thinking. He wrote extensively about what he called the feminist control structure that he believed governed modern society, a conspiracy theory common in incel spaces that portrays women as holding systemic power over men through emotional manipulation and legal systems biased in their favor. In Breck's distorted view, his mother wasn't just a parent setting boundaries. She was a representative of this larger oppressive system, and killing her was an act of liberation rather than murder. He genuinely believed, or had convinced himself to believe, that he was the victim in this scenario. The Manifesto included passages where he anticipated how people would judge him after his parents' deaths, predicting that society would side with Thessalie because the system always protects women and demonizes men who dare to resist. He'd constructed an entire narrative in which he was a tragic hero fighting against impossible odds, rather than a teenager planning to bludgeon his mother to death with a rock. But here's what made the digital evidence particularly powerful from a prosecution standpoint. It showed the calculation behind the crime. This wasn't a teenager who'd absorbed extremist ideology and then impulsively acted on it in a moment of rage. The browser history showed months of research into forensic investigation techniques. He'd studied how police solve murders, what evidence they look for, how they track suspects. He'd learned about cell phone triangulation, which led him to create the alibi of leaving his phone in Round Rock while he drove to Austin. He'd researched fingerprint detection, which explained why investigators found evidence that he'd worn gloves during the murder. Fibers consistent with latex gloves were found at the scene, though the gloves themselves were never recovered. He'd looked into blood spatter patterns and DNA evidence, knowledge that informed his attempts to clean up after the crime, though those attempts had ultimately proven insufficient. The laptop also revealed that Breck had used incognito browsing mode for many of his searches, demonstrating that he understood the concept of digital footprints and was trying to minimize them. What he didn't fully understand, what most people don't realize, is that incognito mode only prevents your browser from saving history locally. It doesn't prevent your internet service provider, your router, or forensic investigators with the proper warrants from seeing what you've searched. The technical team was able to reconstruct his complete browsing history from multiple sources, building a comprehensive picture of his research and planning. They found visits to websites that discussed famous murder cases and how they were solved, forums where people debated the perfect crime, true crime podcasts that analyzed investigative techniques. Breck had been educating himself in forensic science not out of academic interest, but to better understand how to commit murder and avoid detection. It was self-taught criminology in service of matricide. Perhaps most damningly, the digital forensics revealed that Breck had been consuming increasingly extreme content in the weeks leading up to the murder. His YouTube history showed videos with titles like The Feminist Agenda to Destroy Men and Breaking Free from Maternal Control. His Reddit activity showed participation in banned subreddits that glorified violence against women. His Discord messages, recovered from servers he'd participated in, showed him discussing his oppressive mother with other users who encouraged increasingly extreme responses. In one particularly chilling exchange from March 19, 2022, just 3 days before the murder, another user had written, "Sometimes you have to take drastic action to reclaim your power." Breck had responded with a simple emoji, a fist. The digital evidence, combined with the handwritten manifesto, created an irrefutable timeline of radicalization leading to premeditated murder. Defense attorneys could argue about brain development in teenagers, about the influence of online content, about psychological factors that might mitigate responsibility. But they couldn't argue away the months of planning, the detailed documentation, the careful research into how to commit and conceal a crime. Breck Miller hadn't snapped. He hadn't acted impulsively. He'd spent months preparing to kill his mother, documenting his plans like a student working on a term paper, and then he'd executed those plans with the cold efficiency his research had prepared him for. The only thing he hadn't anticipated, the single variable he'd failed to account for in all his careful planning, was that tiny detail Detective Garcia would notice in a living room 40 miles away. He'd researched fingerprints, DNA, cell phone tracking, blood spatter, all the major forensic techniques he'd learned about from true crime content. But he'd never thought to research forensic entomology. He'd never considered that the bees his mother loved so much, the insects he'd dismissed as just another example of her misplaced priorities, would be the witnesses that brought him to justice. It was almost poetic in a dark way. Thessalie had spent 14 years cultivating those carniolan bees, tending to them with care and dedication, learning their biology and behavior, creating a small ecosystem in her backyard. And in death, one of those bees had become her advocate, its tiny, crushed body telling a story that Breck's elaborate alibi couldn't silence. The manifesto and digital evidence showed what he'd planned. The bee showed what he'd actually done. Together, they painted a picture of premeditated murder that would prove impossible for any jury to ignore. The revelation of Luna's true identity added a layer of ethical complexity to the case that would haunt everyone involved for years to come. Because Luna wasn't real. She was Detective Indigo Garcia, running an undercover operation that had been designed to protect vulnerable teenagers, not inadvertently motivate one to commit murder. The operation had been carefully planned and legally authorized, part of a regional task force targeting adults who groomed minors online for illegal sexual relationships. Garcia had created the Luna persona as a 24-year-old woman seeking relationships with younger men, a profile designed to attract and document predatory behavior by adults who initiated contact with someone they believed to be young and vulnerable. The goal was to build cases against online predators, to catch adults who used the anonymity of the internet to exploit teenagers. It was legitimate police work, the kind of undercover operation that had successfully led to dozens of arrests and convictions across the region. But Breck Miller had complicated everything by being the opposite of what the operation was designed to catch. He'd initiated contact with Luna in August 2021 through an encrypted chat app, lying about his age and claiming to be 19, an adult, or so he said. For 7 months, Luna had engaged in progressively intimate conversations with him, carefully documenting everything for eventual prosecution. The operation followed strict protocols. Never initiate sexual content. Never encourage illegal behavior. Simply respond to what the target initiated and gather evidence. Garcia, as Luna, had played the role of a sympathetic listener, someone who seemed to understand Breck's frustrations and validate his feelings. She'd asked open-ended questions designed to prompt him to reveal information about his life, his relationships, his thinking. In a typical case, these conversations would eventually lead to the target suggesting an in-person meeting, at which point law enforcement would make an arrest. The operation was designed to catch adults grooming minors. But Breck had lied about his age from the beginning, claiming to be 19 when he was actually 17. And rather than being groomed, he was using Luna as a confidant, a sympathetic audience for his increasingly radical views about his mother and his belief that he was being systematically oppressed. The ethical paradox at the heart of this case is genuinely devastating when you really think about it. Thessalie Harris, being the responsible parent she was, discovered the conversations with Luna on Breck's laptop in early March 2022. She did exactly what any concerned parent should do. She contacted the police to report that her son was being groomed by an adult woman online. She had no way of knowing that Luna was actually Detective Garcia running a sting operation. And Detective Garcia had no way of knowing that one of her targets was the son of her commanding officer. When Thessalie called the police on March 15, 2022, exactly 1 week before her murder, she spoke with a family services coordinator who took her report seriously and promised to investigate. That coordinator routed the complaint to the appropriate division, following standard procedure, not realizing it would intersect with an ongoing undercover operation. The bureaucratic machinery of a large police department began turning, processing Thessalie's complaint through the proper channels. Garcia received notification on March 18 that a mother had reported her son's involvement with Luna. Task force leadership instructed her to begin winding down the operation to avoid exposure, standard protocol when an operations cover is at risk of being blown. She'd scheduled a final contact with Breck for March 30th, planning to ghost the account afterward and move on to other targets. It was a reasonable timeline. Give the operation about 12 more days, then shut it down cleanly. But Thessalie, not knowing the timeline of police procedure, not understanding that she'd reported an undercover operation rather than an actual predator, had told Breck something that would seal her fate. She'd told him she was going to testify about Luna and have him committed for psychological evaluation. Put yourself in Thessalie's position for a moment. Your 17-year-old son is having intimate online conversations with someone he believes is a 24-year-old woman. You've discovered this relationship and reported it to police. You're terrified that your son is being exploited, possibly groomed for something terrible. You want him to get help, to undergo evaluation, to be protected from what you perceive as a predatory adult. Everything you're doing is coming from a place of love and protective instinct. You're trying to save your child from what you believe is a dangerous situation. Now put yourself in Breck's position, but understand that his position has been distorted by months of radicalization in online echo chambers. In his mind, shaped by incel ideology and narcissistic personality traits, Luna represented his ticket to freedom. She was the person who understood him, who validated his feelings, who promised a future where he could escape what he described as his prison of feminine control. He'd constructed an entire fantasy about turning 18 and running away with Luna, building a life together where he could finally become the man he believed his mother was preventing him from being. When Thessalie told him she was going to testify and have him committed, Breck's entire psychological framework collapsed. In his distorted thinking, his mother wasn't trying to protect him. She was trying to destroy the one relationship that made his life bearable. She was going to expose him in court, have him locked in a psychiatric facility, and testify that he was mentally unfit to make his own decisions. The manifesto revealed his belief that Luna was real, that their relationship was genuine, that once he turned 18, they could be together openly. The revelation that this was all delusion, that Luna was a police detective who viewed him as a case number rather than a soulmate, would have destroyed everything. But here's the crucial thing. At the time of the murder, Breck didn't know Luna was fake. He believed she was real. He believed his mother was going to destroy this relationship and have him committed. And he decided the solution was to eliminate the threat before it could materialize. The tragedy is compounded by the fact that if Thessalie had known Luna was a police detective, she never would have felt threatened. If the bureaucracy had moved faster, if the complaint had been routed more quickly, if someone had made the connection between her report and the ongoing operation, she could have been told, "You're actually reporting one of our undercover officers. Your son isn't being groomed. We're investigating online predators, and your son made contact with our operative." That conversation would have changed everything. But that's not what happened. The system moved at its own pace, information traveling through proper channels, but not quickly enough. And on March 22, 2022, 7 days after Thessalie reported Luna to police and 4 days before the operation was scheduled to shut down, Breck Miller picked up a garden rock and struck his mother 7 times in the backyard apiary. Detective Garcia faced the agonizing task of revealing all of this to Chief Corwin, that his wife had died trying to protect their son from what she perceived as a predatory relationship, and that the predatory relationship was actually an undercover police operation that Garcia herself had been running. Imagine delivering that information. Imagine watching someone process the layers of tragedy, the cascading ironies, the way bureaucracy and procedure and simple bad timing had conspired to create a perfect storm of misunderstanding that ended in murder. The meeting took place on March 26, 2022, in Chief Corwin's home office, a room lined with commendations and photographs from 23 years of service. Garcia watched as his face transformed from confusion to horror to a kind of broken understanding as she walked him through everything. The undercover operation, Breck's contact with Luna, Thessalie's report, the timeline that had left her unaware she was reporting a police detective rather than an actual predator. Chief Corwin aged a decade in the 45 minutes it took Garcia to lay out this aspect of the case. When she finished, he sat in silence for nearly 3 minutes, a span of time that felt endless. Finally, he asked a question that revealed just how completely his understanding of his family had been shattered. Did he really plan to kill me too? Garcia confirmed that yes. According to the Manifesto, Breck's original plan had included killing his father and staging a murder-suicide. Only Corwin's unexpected early return home had forced Breck to improvise, sparing his life not through mercy, but through tactical necessity. The Luna revelation created significant legal and ethical questions that would be debated throughout the trial and beyond. Defense attorneys would argue that Garcia's undercover operation had created a form of psychological entrapment, that her sympathetic responses to Breck's grievances had encouraged his radicalization and contributed to his decision to commit murder. They would present chat logs showing Luna asking Breck about his relationship with his mother, his feelings of independence, his frustrations with parental control. Wasn't this, they would argue, a form of manipulation in itself? Wasn't Detective Garcia, through her Luna persona, grooming Breck to externalize his problems and view his mother as an enemy? Garcia's defense of the operation was legally sound but emotionally complicated. She'd asked open-ended questions consistent with building rapport in undercover operations. She'd never suggested violence, never encouraged Breck to harm anyone, never done anything except allow him to reveal his own thought processes. The chat logs, when read in full rather than in cherry-picked excerpts, showed Breck driving the conversations toward his grievances, not Garcia leading him there. Luna had been a sympathetic listener, yes, but sympathy isn't encouragement. Asking someone, "How does that make you feel?" when they express frustration isn't the same as telling them their frustration is justified or that they should act on it. The legal standard for entrapment requires law enforcement to induce someone to commit a crime they wouldn't have otherwise committed. But the Manifesto and browser history showed Breck had been planning the murder independently of the Luna conversations. He'd been researching forensic techniques, studying his mother's schedule, consuming extremist content that normalized violence against women, all on his own initiative. Luna hadn't planted the idea of murder in his mind. She'd simply been present as a sympathetic audience while his radicalization progressed. But legal defensibility doesn't eliminate moral complexity. Detective Garcia would spend countless sleepless nights replaying the conversations, wondering if she could have said something different, asked different questions, somehow detected that this particular target was spiraling toward violence rather than being victimized by adults. She'd reviewed the protocols with her supervisors, with task force leadership, with the department's lawyers. Everyone agreed she'd followed procedure correctly. The operation had been legitimate. Her conduct had been appropriate. But none of that changed the fact that Thessalie Harris had died, at least in part, because she'd tried to protect her son from a relationship with Luna, a person who didn't actually exist. The what-ifs were endless and tormenting. What if Garcia had shut down the operation a week earlier? What if the bureaucracy had moved faster when Thessalie made her report? What if someone had connected the dots and told Thessalie she was reporting a police operation? What if Garcia, with all her experience reading people, had somehow detected that Breck was more dangerous than victimized? None of these what-ifs changed the fundamental fact that Breck alone bore responsibility for his mother's murder. He'd made the choice to pick up that rock. He'd made the choice to strike 7 times. He'd spent months planning, documenting, preparing to take her life. The Luna operation didn't create a murderer. It simply provided one element of his motivation, one piece of the distorted narrative he'd constructed to justify matricide. The revelation of Luna's true identity became one of the most dramatic moments in the investigation when Garcia revealed it to Breck during his interrogation. The 3-hour interrogation had been carefully structured, starting with softball questions and gradually tightening focus as Garcia presented evidence piece by piece. The bee, the pollen analysis, the phone data, the footprints, the DNA. With each revelation, Breck's confidence had eroded visibly, his shoulders slumping as he realized the alibi he'd thought was perfect had been dismantled by science he hadn't anticipated. But Garcia had waited until 2 hours into the interrogation to deliver what she knew would be the psychological coup de grace. She leaned forward across the interview table and said, in the same voice she'd used during months of online chats, "Breck, I need you to understand something. I am Luna. There is no 24-year-old woman who loves you. There never was. I'm a police detective, and you were part of an undercover operation targeting online predators." The video of that moment captured Breck's face, transforming from confusion to disbelief to a kind of existential horror as his brain processed the information. His entire psychological framework, the delusion that had motivated him to kill his mother, revealed itself as an elaborate law enforcement sting. Everything he'd believed about Luna, every fantasy he'd constructed about their future together, every bit of validation he'd felt from her sympathetic responses, all of it evaporated in that single revelation. Breck's reaction provided prosecutors with powerful evidence of his motive and mental state. He didn't express remorse for killing his mother. He didn't acknowledge the horror of what he'd done. Instead, he became enraged at Detective Garcia, calling her manipulative, accusing her of entrapment, using the language of victimhood that his online radicalization had taught him. He claimed Garcia had psychologically tortured him by posing as Luna, that she'd forced him into a situation where killing his mother seemed like the only option to preserve his relationship. It was a complete inversion of reality, an inability or unwillingness to accept that he'd made choices, that he bore responsibility, that he'd murdered his mother based on his own distorted thinking. His attorney attempted to intervene, advising Breck to stop talking, but he was too far into his emotional spiral to exercise restraint. For 17 minutes, the video shows him ranting about female manipulation, maternal control, and the unfairness of a system designed to emasculate young men. It was the Manifesto brought to life, the toxic ideology that had driven him to murder, now fully visible in his own words, his own voice, his own face contorted with narcissistic rage. The Luna revelation became central to both the prosecution and defense strategies. Prosecutors argued it demonstrated motive, that Breck had killed his mother to prevent her from exposing his relationship and having him committed. Defense attorneys argued it demonstrated manipulation, that the undercover operation had contributed to Breck's deteriorating mental state and his ultimate decision to commit violence. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the Luna revelation was what it showed about modern policing, online crime, and the unpredictable ways that legitimate law enforcement operations can intersect with personal tragedies in the digital age. Detective Garcia had been doing her job, following protocols designed to catch predators. Thessalie Harris had been doing her job as a mother, trying to protect her son from what she perceived as danger. And Breck Miller, consuming toxic ideology in online spaces while constructing fantasies about a person who didn't exist, had brought these two worlds crashing together in the most violent way possible. The case raised questions that extended far beyond this single murder. How do we police online spaces without inadvertently creating complications in investigations? How do parents protect children from genuine online threats while avoiding false alarms about legitimate law enforcement operations? How do undercover operations account for targets who lie about their age and use the operations for purposes other than what investigators anticipate? These questions had no easy answers, but they would shape policy discussions in law enforcement and child protection circles for years to come. For Detective Garcia personally, the Luna revelation meant carrying a weight that went beyond solving a case. She'd done everything by the book, followed every protocol, made no mistakes in her conduct of the operation. But a woman was dead, and Garcia's undercover persona had been part of the chain of events that led to that death, however indirectly. She would eventually retire from undercover work entirely, unable to continue that type of assignment after the emotional toll of the Breck Miller case. She continued her work in homicide, solving cases, bringing justice to victims, But the Luna operation was her last. And she thought often about Thessalie Harris, about a woman she'd never met, whose death resulted from a perfect storm of circumstances that no one could have fully predicted or prevented. The tragedy within the tragedy was this. Everyone had been trying to do the right thing. Garcia was trying to catch predators. Thessalie was trying to protect her son. Chief Corwin was trying to serve his community. Even the bureaucrats processing Thessalie's complaint were following proper procedure. But Breck Miller, radicalized by online extremism and consumed by narcissistic grievance, had interpreted all of it through a distorted lens that ended with 7 blows from a garden rock and a mother lying dead among her bees. Luna was a ghost, a fiction, a police operation. But her impact on this case, and on all the lives it destroyed, was devastatingly real. The arrest of Breck Miller took place on March 28, 2022, at the Yates family home in Round Rock, where he'd continued staying in the days following his mother's funeral. Detective Garcia led a team of 4 officers to execute the arrest warrant, timing their arrival for 6:45 a.m. to catch Breck before he was fully awake and potentially reactive. There's a strategy to early morning arrests that goes beyond just catching suspects off guard. People are generally less combative, less able to mount resistance, more vulnerable in those first moments of consciousness when the brain is still transitioning from sleep to wakefulness. The team found him in the guest bedroom, still in his sleep clothes, his reaction to seeing uniformed officers a mixture of confusion and dawning recognition. You could see it in his face, that moment when sleep-fogged confusion cleared and reality crashed in. The understanding that his carefully constructed alibi hadn't held, that somehow, despite all his planning and research, the police had figured it out. Garcia read him his Miranda rights with the careful precision she'd learned over 9 years of investigations. Watching his face as she explained, he was being charged with first-degree murder in the death of Thessalie Harris. Breck's immediate response wasn't denial, and that's significant, really significant. He didn't say what? No, I was here all morning. He didn't express shock or outrage at being falsely accused. Instead, he asked a question that would later be played for the jury, a question that functioned as an admission wrapped in curiosity. How did you know? Think about what that question reveals. It's not the question of an innocent person. It's the question of someone who believed he'd committed the perfect crime, who'd planned meticulously, who'd constructed what he thought was an unbreakable alibi, and who now desperately wanted to know what mistake he'd made. It was the question of a chess player who'd just been checkmated and couldn't figure out which move had cost him the game. Detective Garcia didn't answer immediately. She simply said, "We'll talk about that at the station," maintaining the tactical advantage of keeping him uncertain and off balance. The interrogation that followed Breck's arrest became one of the most psychologically revealing pieces of evidence in the prosecution's case. Conducted at Austin PD headquarters with Breck's court-appointed attorney present, because as soon as he'd been arrested, he'd invoked his right to counsel, showing some awareness of legal procedure. The 3-hour session was recorded on video that captured not just words but body language, micro-expressions, and the gradual dissolution of Breck's carefully constructed facade. Detective Garcia led the interrogation with the skill that had made her one of the department's most effective investigators. She understood the psychology of interrogation, the way you start soft and gradually increase pressure, the way you present evidence methodically rather than all at once, giving the suspect multiple opportunities to slip up, to contradict themselves, to reveal truths they hadn't intended to reveal. She began with softball questions about Breck's relationship with his mother, framing it conversationally rather than accusatorially. "Tell me about Thessalie. What was she like as a mom?" Breck's initial responses were measured, practiced, almost, painting a picture of a normal teenage boy with a normal life and a loving, if sometimes strict, mother. He talked about family dinners, about how his mom had taught him to cook, about her beekeeping hobby that he found kind of weird, but also kind of cool. It was a performance, and Garcia recognized it as such, but she let him continue, building a baseline of how he spoke when he was comfortable, when he felt in control. Then, gradually, she tightened the focus. "Walk me through the morning of March 22nd. What time did you wake up? What did you do?" Breck recounted his alibi. Waking up around 10 o'clock, Emma still asleep upstairs, playing video games, texting friends. The story was consistent with what he'd told investigators before, smooth and rehearsed. Garcia listened without interrupting, letting him commit to his version of events. Then she started presenting the evidence, piece by piece, watching his confidence erode with each revelation. Here's something interesting, Breck. We analyzed the bee I found on your shoe. It's a Carniolan honeybee, the same breed your mother kept in her apiary. Pretty unusual breed for Texas, actually. Your mom's hives are registered with the state as purebred Carniolan stock. She watched his face carefully, saw the tiny flicker of uncertainty, the way his eyes shifted almost imperceptibly. The thing is, this bee was carrying pollen from a corpse lily. You know what that is? It's this rare plant, smells like rotting meat, really hard to grow. There's only one registered corpse lily in the entire Austin area. Want to guess where it is? The silence that followed that question stretched out uncomfortably. Breck's attorney placed a hand on his arm, a silent signal to be careful, but Breck was already off balance, his mind racing to figure out how a bee could possibly have gotten on his shoe if he'd been 40 miles away all morning. Garcia continued, her tone still conversational, but the pressure steadily increasing. We also did something called metabolic analysis on the bee. Fascinating science, really. We can determine approximately when it died based on cellular breakdown, enzyme degradation, bacterial colonization. This bee died between 10 and noon on March 22nd. Your mom was killed between 9:45 and 10:15 that morning. Quite a coincidence, don't you think? She pulled out photographs, laying them on the table between them. Microscopic images of the bee, the pollen grains magnified to show their distinctive structure, DNA analysis results showing a 99.7% match to Thessalie's hives. Each photograph was another nail in the coffin of his alibi, another piece of evidence he hadn't anticipated, couldn't explain away. And then there's your phone, Garcia said, pulling out another set of documents. All those text messages you sent that morning? They were scheduled messages, Breck. Set up the night before. Your phone was in Round Rock, but you weren't with it. She showed him the technical analysis, the metadata that revealed the truth behind his alibi. We also have surveillance footage. The neighbor's camera caught someone matching your description leaving through the Yates back door at 8:47 a.m. and returning at 11:53. Traffic cameras show a vehicle matching the car you had access to traveling south on I-35 toward Austin around 9 a.m. and north toward Round Rock around 11:40 a.m. With each piece of evidence, Breck's body language changed. His shoulders slumped. His breathing became shallower. The confident teenager who'd believed himself untouchable behind his 40-mile alibi was watching his perfect crime dissolve under the weight of science he'd never anticipated. His hands, which had been steady when the interrogation began, now trembled slightly. Garcia could see him mentally scrambling, trying to figure out how all of this was possible, how the police had reconstructed movements he'd believed were invisible. We found footprints in the soil around your mother's apiary. Garcia continued, relentless now. Size 10.5, matching your shoes. Distinctive wear pattern on the right heel that matches your gait exactly. The prints were fresh, made the morning of the murder. And there's more. She pulled out DNA analysis results. We found blood transfer patterns on the gate latch and a fence post near where your mom's body was discovered. Mixed in with her blood were epithelial cells, skin cells. The DNA from those cells matches yours with statistical certainty that excludes every other person on Earth. You touched those surfaces with blood on your hands, Breck. Your mother's blood. The evidence was overwhelming, presented methodically, building an irrefutable case that he'd been at the scene during the murder. But Garcia had saved the most devastating revelation for last, waiting until 2 hours into the interrogation when Breck had exhausted his denials and half-truths, when his psychological defenses were worn down and vulnerable. She leaned forward across the interview table, and when she spoke, her voice carried a tone that Breck would recognize immediately, because it was the same voice he'd heard for 7 months in online chats. The voice of the person he believed loved him, understood him, promised him freedom. Breck, I need you to understand something. I am Luna. She let that sink in for a moment, watching his face register confusion, then disbelief, then the dawning horror of comprehension. There is no 24-year-old woman who loves you. There never was. I'm a police detective, and you were part of an undercover operation targeting online predators. Every conversation we had, every message you sent to Luna, all of it was documented as part of a criminal investigation. Luna wasn't real. She was me, doing my job. The psychological impact of this revelation was captured in excruciating detail on the interrogation video. Breck's face went through a series of transformations. Confusion giving way to disbelief, disbelief giving way to comprehension, comprehension giving way to something that looked like a complete existential collapse. His entire framework for understanding his life, his choices, his motivations, revealed itself as built on a foundation of delusion. The person he believed was his soulmate, his escape from maternal oppression, his validation and understanding. That person had never existed. It was a police detective conducting an undercover operation, viewing him as a case file rather than a romantic partner. For several long moments, Breck sat in stunned silence, his brain clearly struggling to process information that fundamentally contradicted everything he'd believed. Then, instead of the remorse or horror you might expect from someone realizing they'd murdered their mother based on a delusion, Breck became enraged. Not at himself, not at the choices he'd made, but at Detective Garcia. He called her manipulative, accused her of entrapment, used language that revealed just how thoroughly his online radicalization had shaped his thinking. "You psychologically tortured me," he said, his voice rising despite his attorney's attempts to get him to stop talking. "You made me think there was someone who understood me, who cared about me, and it was all fake. You forced me into a situation where I had to protect our relationship. You made me do this." It was a stunning display of narcissistic deflection, an inability or unwillingness to accept personal responsibility. In Breck's distorted thinking, he wasn't a murderer who'd killed his mother based on his own choices. He was a victim of police manipulation, forced into violence by Detective Garcia's deception. His attorney was visibly trying to intervene, pulling on his arm, whispering urgently that he needed to stop talking, but Breck was too far into his emotional breakdown to exercise restraint. For 17 minutes, the video captured him ranting about female manipulation, about how the system was designed to emasculate young men, about how his mother and Detective Garcia and society in general had conspired to destroy him. It was the Manifesto brought to life, the toxic ideology that had driven him to murder now fully visible for the cameras. He talked about genocentric control structures and beta male subjugation, jargon pulled directly from incel forums that would sound completely alien to anyone not immersed in those online spaces. He described his mother as part of a larger system of oppression, as though killing her was some form of justified resistance rather than matricide motivated by narcissistic rage. The interrogation video would become one of the prosecution's most powerful pieces of evidence, not because it contained a traditional confession. Breck never explicitly said, "Yes, I killed my mother," but because it revealed his complete absence of remorse, his narcissistic worldview, his inability to accept responsibility for his choices. Jurors would watch this video and see not a troubled teenager deserving sympathy, but a calculating individual who'd planned and executed murder and then tried to position himself as the victim when caught. After the interrogation, Breck was formally booked into the Travis County Jail, processed through the system that would hold him until trial. His mugshot, taken in the early evening of March 28th, showed a face that had already changed from the clean-cut teenager who'd been playing video games in Round Rock just days before. There was something harder in his expression, a kind of bitter defiance that suggested he still didn't fully grasp the magnitude of what he'd done or the consequences he was facing. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Biological evidence placing him at the scene, digital evidence dismantling his alibi, physical evidence showing his contact with the crime scene, psychological evidence demonstrating premeditation and motive. The bee, that tiny insect that had started as an almost invisible detail, had led to the unraveling of what Breck had believed was the perfect crime. His months of research into forensic techniques had covered fingerprints, DNA, cell phone tracking, blood spatter, all the major forensic disciplines he'd learned about from true crime content. But he'd never thought to research entomology. He'd never considered that the insects his mother loved, the bees he'd viewed as just another example of her misplaced priorities, would be the witnesses that brought him to justice. That single bee, crushed beneath his shoe as he fled the scene of his mother's murder, had told a story that his elaborate alibi couldn't silence. Science had spoken with the kind of clarity and certainty that makes prosecutions possible. And now, Breck Miller would face a jury of his peers, would be forced to answer not just for the murder he'd committed, but for the complete absence of remorse he demonstrated in its aftermath. The trial of Breck Miller began on October 17, 2022, in the 299th District Court of Travis County, with Judge Kalani Tiosopo presiding over a courtroom that had been modified to accommodate intense media interest and significant security concerns. 7 months had passed since that Tuesday morning when Thessalie Harris died in her backyard apiary, 7 months during which the case had been dissected in every news outlet in Texas and beyond. The story had everything that captures public attention. A police chief's family destroyed from within, cutting-edge forensic science solving a seemingly perfect crime, online radicalization leading to real-world violence, and the specter of the death penalty for a teenage defendant. Jury selection alone had taken 3 days, winnowing a pool of 180 potential jurors down to 12 members and 4 alternates who'd convinced both sides they could be fair despite the extensive pretrial publicity. Finding impartial jurors in a case this high-profile is always challenging, but it's particularly difficult when the victim was married to the city's police chief and when every detail of the crime had been discussed ad nauseum on social media, in coffee shops, in living rooms across Austin. The final jury consisted of 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from 24 to 67, representing a cross-section of Austin's diverse population. Prosecutor Audrey Torres had looked for jurors who could handle complex scientific evidence without being overwhelmed by it, people who wouldn't be swayed by sympathy for a teenage defendant when confronted with evidence of calculated planning. Defense attorney Marcus Shaw had sought jurors who might be troubled by executing someone for crimes committed at age 17, people who believed in the possibility of rehabilitation, who might see Breck as a troubled kid rather than an irredeemable monster. The composition of the jury suggested both sides had partially achieved their goals, setting up what promised to be a hard-fought battle over Breck's fate. Prosecutor Torres's opening statement lasted 47 minutes and laid out a narrative of betrayal, radicalization, and calculated murder that held the courtroom in rapt attention. She didn't begin with the murder itself, which is what many prosecutors might do, lead with the dramatic moment, the violence, the shock value. Instead, she started with Thessalie Harris's life, describing a woman who'd built a career helping law enforcement solve complex financial crimes, who'd raised bees as meditation and connection to nature, who'd loved her children fiercely even when they made that love difficult. Torres showed the jury photographs of Thessalie in her apiary, tending her hives with visible care and attention, her face peaceful in a way that made the contrast with what came next even more devastating. She described Thessalie's contributions to the community, the free financial literacy classes she taught at the library, the honey she donated to food banks, the way neighbors described her as someone who genuinely cared about making her corner of the world better. Only after establishing Thessalie as a full, complex human being, not just the victim, but a person with dreams, relationships, and value, did Torres pivot to describe how her own son had murdered her. The transition was brutal and effective. This woman, who dedicated her life to service and family, died terrified and in pain as her 17-year-old son struck her 7 times with a rock from her own garden. She died in the place she loved most, surrounded by the bees she'd tended for 14 years, killed by the child she would have given her life to protect. The jury's faces reflected shock and revulsion as Torres detailed the planning revealed in the manifesto, the months of research into forensic techniques, the constructed alibi that demonstrated calculated intent rather than impulsive rage. She walked them through the evidence they'd be hearing, the bee that placed Breck at the scene, the pollen analysis that provided a timeline, the DNA evidence, the digital forensics, the manifesto itself. This isn't a case where you'll have to weigh conflicting witness testimony or questionable circumstantial evidence, Torres told the jury, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who knows she has an airtight case. This is a case where biology, physics, and technology all point to the same inescapable conclusion. Breck Miller murdered his mother with premeditation and then tried to escape justice through planning that ultimately failed because he stepped on a bee. The prosecution's case unfolded over 8 days of testimony that methodically built an unassailable scientific foundation for Breck's guilt. Dr. Helena Vasquez testified for nearly 6 hours across 2 days, explaining the bee and pollen evidence with a combination of scientific rigor and accessible language that helped the jury understand how a single insect could serve as such powerful proof. She brought enlarged photographs showing the bees' pollen baskets under microscopic magnification, the distinctive corpse lily pollen grains visible in striking detail. She walked them through the DNA sequencing process that matched the bee to Thessalie's hive number 8 with 99.7% certainty, a number that leaves essentially no room for doubt. Most powerfully, she explained the timeline analysis, demonstrating how the bee's death within 90 minutes of being crushed, combined with its collection of pollen during the murder window, created what she called a biological timestamp that places the defendant at the crime scene during the precise moment his mother was killed. Defense attorney Shaw's cross-examination tried to poke holes in the time of death estimates, suggesting the margins of error were wider than Dr. Vasquez acknowledged. But even accounting for maximum uncertainty, the timeline still placed Breck at the scene during the critical period. The science was simply too solid to effectively challenge. Detective Garcia's testimony spanned 3 full days and represented the emotional heart of the prosecution's case. She walked the jury through the investigation from start to finish, her arrival at the crime scene, the initial interviews with family members, that crucial moment when she noticed the bee on Breck's shoe during the interview in Round Rock. Her description of that observation had the quality of something almost novelistic. "I saw this tiny insect embedded in the tread pattern of his shoe, and in that moment, everything clicked." Mrs. Harris had been killed in her apiary. Breck supposedly hadn't been home. But there was a bee on his shoe. Not just any bee, but what looked like one of the carniolan bees I'd heard Mrs. Harris talk about at department functions. The probability of that being coincidental was essentially zero. But it was Garcia's testimony about the Luna operation that created the trial's most dramatic moment. Torres had her explain the undercover work in detail, the creation of the persona, how Breck had initiated contact, how she documented conversations designed to identify adults soliciting minors for illegal relationships. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as Torres asked Garcia to reveal herself as Luna to the jury, just as she'd done to Breck during the interrogation. "I am Luna," Garcia said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying the emotional toll this case had taken. "There was no 24-year-old woman. It was me, conducting a legitimate police operation that Breck's mother inadvertently reported when she discovered the conversations and tried to protect her son." Then came the interrogation video, 3 hours of recording edited down to 47 minutes of the most incriminating segments. The jury watched Breck's reactions to each piece of evidence, his confidence eroding, his alibi crumbling, his face transforming when Garcia revealed herself as Luna. They saw his 17-minute rant about female manipulation and maternal oppression, his complete failure to express remorse for taking his mother's life. Several jurors visibly shook their heads during the video, particularly when Breck described himself as the victim, when he blamed Detective Garcia for forcing him to kill his mother to protect a relationship that had never actually existed. The forensic evidence continued with testimony from crime scene reconstruction specialists, DNA analysts, digital forensics experts who traced Breck's online activities and uncovered his research into how to commit and conceal murder. The shoe print analysis matched his distinctive gait. The blood transfer DNA placed his cells mixed with his mother's blood on surfaces he'd touched while fleeing. The phone data showed the sophisticated alibi construction, scheduled messages, strategic positioning of the device, all designed to create the appearance of being somewhere he wasn't. The browser history revealed months of searches. How long do fingerprints last? Do police check shoes for evidence? Cell phone tracking by police. How to kill someone quickly and quietly. Each piece of evidence was another brick in a wall of proof that defense attorney Shaw could barely dent during cross-examination. But perhaps no testimony carried more devastating weight than that of Chief Stellan Corwin, who took the stand on the 7th day of trial dressed in civilian clothes, having resigned his position under pressure from community groups and his own recognition that he couldn't continue serving as police chief after what had happened. Prosecutor Torres questioned him gently but thoroughly, establishing the firearms in his safe that had belonged to Breck, illegally purchased through straw buyers, the conversations he'd had with Thessalie about their son's increasingly troubling behavior, and the Manifesto's revelation that Breck had planned to kill him along with his mother. Corwin's voice broke multiple times, particularly when Torres asked him to describe finding Thessalie's body in the apiary. "It was the end of the world I knew," he said, his hands gripping the witness stand rail. "Everything after, the investigation, the arrest, this trial, it all feels like moving through a nightmare I can't wake up from." Defense attorney Shaw's cross-examination attempted to establish that Corwin's testimony was coerced through the threat of firearms charges, but Corwin's response undercut that strategy completely. "The immunity agreement influenced my decision to cooperate," he admitted. "But my testimony is truthful regardless of those circumstances. Everything I've said here is accurate to the best of my knowledge. Yes, they had leverage over me, but that leverage forced me to do what I should have done from the beginning. Tell the complete truth about my son's crimes and my own failures as a father." The most dramatic moment of Corwin's testimony came when Torres asked him to read a passage from Breck's Manifesto, the section describing the original plan to murder both parents. His hands trembled as he read his son's words aloud. "The old man will be harder to kill than the matriarch. He's trained, armed, and paranoid, but he's also predictable. He comes home at 6 p.m. every Tuesday and Thursday. He parks in the garage, enters through the kitchen, and goes directly to his study to check emails. He won't see it coming. Neither of them will see it coming. And when it's done, when both sources of my oppression are eliminated, I'll be free to start my life with Luna." The courtroom sat in stunned silence as Corwin finished reading, tears streaming down his face. He looked directly at Breck for the first time during his testimony and said, his voice raw with emotion, "I failed you as a father. I should have seen this coming. But what you did to your mother is unforgivable." And then Breck smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a misunderstood expression, but a clear, contemptuous smirk directed at his father, visible to everyone in the courtroom, including every member of the jury. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds before defense attorney Shaw noticed and visibly reacted, touching Breck's arm in what appeared to be a warning to control his facial expressions. But the damage was done. The jury had seen, in real time, the narcissistic contempt that had driven Breck to murder his mother and plan his father's death. The defense's case, when it finally came, was hampered by the overwhelming strength of the prosecution's evidence. Shaw didn't dispute that Breck had killed his mother. The science made that essentially impossible to deny. Instead, he framed his defense around diminished capacity, arguing that Breck's exposure to online extremist content had created a form of psychological coercion that impaired his ability to appreciate the wrongfulness of his actions. He called expert witnesses on adolescent brain development and online radicalization, painting Breck as a vulnerable teenager who'd been manipulated by sophisticated propaganda designed to radicalize young men. But these arguments struggled against the evidence of Breck's careful planning, his months of research, his construction of an elaborate alibi. Dr. Chun, the forensic psychiatrist who'd evaluated Breck, testified that while he showed narcissistic traits and had been exposed to radicalizing content, he fully understood that killing his mother was wrong. He simply believed society was wrong to condemn him for it. The distinction was crucial. Legal insanity requires not understanding that an action is wrong, but Breck understood perfectly well. He just disagreed with the moral judgment society placed on his actions. And then Breck made the decision that would seal his fate. Against his attorney's strong advice, he insisted on testifying in his own defense. Shaw had argued strenuously that nothing good could come from putting Breck on the stand, that his narcissistic personality traits and inability to express genuine remorse would alienate the jury. But Breck believed he could convince them to see him as a victim rather than a murderer. He took the stand on November 9, 2022, dressed in a suit his attorney had provided, and for 2 hours of direct examination, Shaw guided him through a version of events that attempted to frame the murder as a tragic outcome of online radicalization and psychological manipulation by the Luna operation. Breck described himself as a lonely teenager who'd found community online, who'd believed Luna represented hope for a different future, who'd felt trapped when his mother threatened to have him committed and testify against Luna. But everything changed when Prosecutor Torres began her cross-examination. For nearly 4 hours across 2 days, she systematically destroyed any sympathy the jury might have developed. She read passages from his manifesto and asked him to explain specific phrases. She presented his browser history showing months of research into forensic techniques. She played segments of his interrogation video, showing his rant about female manipulation. And then she asked the question that exposed everything. Mr. Miller, in the 8 months since you killed your mother, have you ever expressed genuine remorse for taking her life? Not regret about being caught, not anger about the consequences, but actual sorrow for what you did to a woman who loved you. After a long pause, Breck responded, I regret that things turned out this way. It wasn't remorse. It was a passive construction that avoided taking responsibility. The jury's faces showed they'd noticed. The trial concluded with closing arguments that crystallized the fundamental question. Was Breck Miller a troubled teenager deserving of mercy, or a calculating killer who'd earned the ultimate punishment? The jury would deliberate for 9 hours and 11 minutes before returning with an answer that would determine whether a 17-year-old would spend his life in prison or die by lethal injection for murdering his mother. The jury deliberations began at 3:47 p.m. on November 15, 2022, after Judge Tiosopo provided detailed instructions on the law governing first-degree murder, the standards for considering evidence, and the requirement for unanimous verdicts. They deliberated for 4 hours and 23 minutes that first day before being sequestered for the night, resuming at 9 o'clock the following morning. The relatively short deliberation time suggested the strength of the prosecution's evidence, though observers noted the jury had requested to review several pieces of evidence, including the interrogation video and portions of the manifesto, suggesting they were being thorough rather than rushing to judgment. At 2:34 p.m. on November 16th, after a total of 9 hours and 11 minutes of deliberation, the jury informed the bailiff they'd reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed when Judge Tiosopo reconvened court at 3 o'clock to receive the verdict. Chief Corwin sat in the front row of the gallery, flanked by Merritt and Thessalie's mother, all three looking exhausted by weeks of testimony and the emotional toll of watching their family's destruction become public record. Breck sat at the defense table in his suit, his expression carefully neutral after his attorney had apparently counseled him extensively about controlling his reactions following that disastrous smirk during his father's testimony. The jury foreman, a 52-year-old high school teacher named Patricia Ningyan, stood when Judge Tiosopo asked if they'd reached a verdict. She confirmed they had reached unanimous decisions on all charges, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly as she held the verdict form. The moment stretched out with painful tension, a teenage boy's life hanging in the balance of words about to be spoken. We, the jury, find the defendant Breck Miller guilty of murder in the first degree. The clerk read, her voice steady and clear. The words landed like a physical blow. Chief Corwin's shoulders shook with silent sobs, while Thessalie's mother cried openly in the gallery. Breck's reaction was minimal, a slight tensing of his jaw, but no tears, no visible emotion beyond a kind of resignation. The clerk continued reading verdicts on the additional charges: guilty of abuse of a corpse for his attempts to disturb the crime scene, guilty of obstruction of justice for the alibi construction. On each charge, the verdict was unanimous and unequivocal. The guilt phase was over, but the most agonizing decision still lay ahead. Would Breck receive life in prison or death by lethal injection? Judge Tiosopo thanked the jury for their service and informed them they would return the following week for the sentencing phase, where they would hear additional evidence specific to the question of punishment and ultimately decide whether a 17-year-old should be executed for murdering his mother. The sentencing phase began on November 21, 2022, with a courtroom atmosphere even heavier than during the guilt phase. Prosecutor Torres opened by presenting victim impact evidence. Friends and colleagues of Thessalie testifying about the hole her death had left in the community. They described her volunteer work, her generosity, her passion for using her skills to help others. The cumulative effect was devastating, transforming Thessalie from an abstract victim into a fully realized person whose loss rippled through countless lives. But the most anticipated and dreaded testimony came on November 22nd when Chief Corwin was recalled to the stand to testify specifically about whether the jury should sentence his son to death. His appearance had changed markedly. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the 3 weeks since the guilt phase, his hair grayer and his face carrying the weight of impossible choices. Prosecutor Torres's examination was brief and focused, asking Corwin to describe Thessalie's impact on his life and the void her death had created. When she asked him directly whether he believed Breck should receive the death penalty, Corwin broke down completely. Through sobs that shook his entire body, he said words that would be replayed in media coverage for weeks. "I loved my son. I still love my son. God help me." But what he did to Thessalie, to the woman who gave him life and loved him unconditionally, is unforgivable. She died terrified and betrayed by the child she would have given her life to protect. If the law says his punishment is death, then I cannot argue against it. Defense attorney Shaw's cross-examination attempted to establish that Corwin's testimony was influenced by the coercion of the immunity agreement, but Corwin's response was unequivocal. The agreement had forced him to testify, but his beliefs about Breck's culpability were his own. Shaw then tried a different approach, asking Corwin to describe Breck as a child, to remind the jury that the defendant was still a teenager. Corwin acknowledged that Breck had been a normal child in many ways, but also noted warning signs he'd missed or dismissed: the increasing isolation, the obsession with online communities, the growing resentment toward his mother. The cross-examination's most dramatic moment came when Shaw asked if Corwin had ever imagined during Breck's childhood that his son would grow up to commit matricide. Corwin's answer was delivered directly to the jury. No parent imagines their child will become a murderer. We see what we want to see. We explain away the warning signs. I failed Thessalie by not recognizing the monster growing in our home. But my failure as a father doesn't excuse what Breck did. He made choices. He planned and executed a murder. And he's shown no remorse, no growth, no indication he understands the magnitude of what he's taken from this world. If sparing his life served any purpose beyond satisfying my own selfish desire to keep my son alive, I would beg you for mercy. But I have seen no evidence that mercy would honor Thessalie's memory or protect anyone from future harm. And then something unprecedented happened. Breck Miller smiled. Not a nervous smile or a misunderstood expression, but a clear, contemptuous smirk directed at his father, visible to everyone in the courtroom, including every member of the jury. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds before his attorney noticed and visibly reacted, but the damage was catastrophic. The jury had seen, in real time, the narcissistic contempt that had driven Breck to murder his mother and plan his father's death. Judge Teosopo called a brief recess as the courtroom erupted in murmurs and shocked reactions. Several jurors were seen shaking their heads in disbelief, and one woman on the jury appeared to be fighting back tears of anger. When court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted palpably. What had been a difficult sentencing decision had become, for many observers, a clear moral imperative. The defense's sentencing case focused on brain development and the possibility of rehabilitation, presenting evidence about the prefrontal cortex's incomplete development in teenagers and statistics showing some juvenile offenders demonstrated genuine rehabilitation after decades in prison. But the prosecution's rebuttal systematically dismantled these arguments, presenting evidence that Breck had shown no evolution in his thinking during the 8 months since his arrest. Recorded jail conversations showed him continuing to describe himself as a victim, referring to his mother's death as necessary. Torres argued the jury was being asked to bet on a transformation Breck had shown no capacity for, to spare his life based on hypothetical future rehabilitation rather than any actual evidence of change. The jury's sentencing deliberations began on November 28th and lasted 2 full days, far longer than the guilt phase deliberations, suggesting the moral difficulty of the decision they faced. They requested to review Breck's testimony, the interrogation video, manifesto excerpts, and video of his reaction during his father's testimony, evidence relating to his demeanor and remorse. On November 30th, 2022, at 4:47 p.m., they informed the bailiff they'd reached a decision. Judge Teosopo reconvened court at 5:15 p.m., the courtroom even more crowded than for the guilt verdict. The tension was palpable as the jury filed in, their faces showing the weight of what they'd decided. The jury foreman stood and confirmed they'd reached a unanimous decision on sentencing. The clerk accepted the verdict form, and the pause before she spoke stretched into what felt like eternity. "We, the jury, having found the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree, hereby sentence Breck Miller to death by lethal injection." The words were followed by audible gasps, sobs from Thessalie's family, a collective exhale from people who'd been holding their breath. Breck's reaction was minimal, a slight tightening around his eyes, but no dramatic breakdown. The clerk continued reading verdicts on additional charges: 50 years for abuse of a corpse, additional years for obstruction of justice, all to be served concurrently with the death sentence, ensuring that even if his death sentence was overturned on appeal, he would never walk free. Judge Teosopo thanked the jury and then took the unusual step of addressing Breck directly. She spoke for approximately 15 minutes, her voice carrying the weight of 12 years on the bench, noting that this case stood apart from countless others she'd presided over. She acknowledged his youth, but noted that age didn't excuse premeditation, careful planning, and calculated cruelty. She spoke about the manifesto, the plans to kill both parents, the complete absence of remorse. Her voice broke only once, when she described watching the video of Breck's smirk during his father's testimony as one of the most disturbing moments of my career on the bench. Then she delivered the words that would define this trial. Mr. Miller, in 12 years as a judge, I have presided over murders committed in rage, in desperation, in the fog of mental illness. I have seen defendants whose crimes, while terrible, reflected moments of human weakness that we can understand, even if we cannot excuse. Your case is different. You planned your mother's murder for months. You researched how to kill her and avoid detection. You created an elaborate alibi. You struck her 7 times with enough force to fracture her skull, showing violence that goes beyond anything necessary to end a life. And then, when caught, you showed no remorse, no understanding of the magnitude of what you'd done. You smirked when your father testified about your plan to kill him. You've treated this court, this jury, and your mother's memory with contempt. She paused, making eye contact with Breck. This is the worst case I've seen in my time on this bench. The sentence of death is not only legally appropriate, but morally necessary. Judge Teosopo formally imposed the sentence, ordering that Breck be remanded to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice and executed by lethal injection after exhaustion of all appeals. She set automatic appeal deadlines, noting that death penalty cases receive enhanced scrutiny and multiple levels of appellate review, meaning Breck would likely spend years, if not decades, on death row as his case worked through the appeals process. For the families involved, this meant years more of living with the case, of potential retrials or hearings, of never being fully able to move beyond the tragedy. Chief Corwin's victim impact statement, read after sentencing, provided a devastating coda. He described Thessalie as the center of our family, the person who held everything together, acknowledged his failures as a father, but affirmed that those failures didn't excuse Breck's choices. He ended with a direct message to Breck. I loved you from the moment you were born. I love you still, though that love is now poisoned by what you've done. I hope that somewhere in the years you have left, you find the capacity for genuine remorse. I hope you eventually understand the enormity of what you took from this world when you killed your mother. And I hope that understanding brings you no peace, because you deserve none. The courtroom cleared slowly, spectators filing out with subdued demeanor. Breck was led away in handcuffs, heading to death row at the Polunsky unit in Livingston, Texas, where he would join approximately 200 other condemned inmates awaiting execution, living in 22-hour-a-day isolation as his appeals progressed. The average time between sentencing and execution in Texas was approximately 11 years, meaning Breck would likely be in his late 20s if and when he was led to the execution chamber. Outside the courthouse, Prosecutor Torres described the verdict as justice for Thessalie Harris and accountability for calculated, premeditated murder. When asked if she had regrets about seeking death for a 17-year-old, she responded, "My regret is that Thessalie Harris is dead, killed by the son she loved. My regret is that Chief Corwin had to testify against his own child. My regret is that a family has been destroyed by ideology learned in online cesspools. But I have no regrets about holding Breck Miller accountable for his choices." Defense attorney Shaw promised aggressive appeals, arguing that executing someone for crimes committed at 17 violated evolving standards of decency, but acknowledged the uphill battle ahead. The community reaction was mixed, reflecting the moral complexity of executing a teenage defendant even for such a brutal crime, but also recognition that Breck's planning and complete lack of remorse made this case different from typical juvenile offender scenarios. The case's impact extended beyond the immediate verdict, sparking conversations about online radicalization, parental responsibility, and mental health resources for teenagers. School districts implemented programs to identify students consuming extremist content. Internet platforms faced renewed pressure to monitor content promoting violence against women. Parents' groups organized workshops on monitoring children's online activities. Thessalie Harris's legacy lived on through the foundation established in her name, supporting financial literacy education and beekeeping programs in underserved communities. Her apiary was maintained by volunteers, with honey donated to food banks in her memory. Chief Corwin retired from law enforcement, relocated to West Texas seeking privacy, and became an advocate for gun safety reform. Detective Garcia continued her homicide work but retired from undercover operations, the Luna case having taken a personal toll that made continuing that assignment untenable. The bee that solved the case became a symbol of how justice can emerge from the smallest details, studied in forensic science courses as an exemplar of careful observation and thorough analysis. Breck Miller's time on death row began with the first of many appeals in February 2023, raising issues including the Manifesto's admission, Chief Corwin's testimony, the Luna operation's propriety, and the constitutionality of executing someone for crimes committed at 17. These appeals would work through state and federal courts over years, possibly decades, while Breck remained in isolation at Polunsky Unit, reportedly showing no remorse and spending time writing letters to supporters in online extremist communities who viewed him as a martyr. The final accounting of the case came not in courtrooms, but in changed lives. Merritt dropped out of UT and enrolled elsewhere under a new name, seeking to escape media attention. Chief Corwin lived quietly, volunteering with youth programs and speaking about gun safety and online radicalization dangers, never remarrying. Detective Garcia continued solving cases but thought often about Thessalie, about the what-ifs that haunted her despite knowing Breck alone bore responsibility. Judge Teosopo continued her bench work, but said in interviews that the Breck Miller trial had changed her understanding of evil, that his calculated planning and contemptuous smirk represented a moral void that no psychological explanation could fully account for. Her statement that it was the worst case I've seen captured the sense that Breck's crime stood apart not just in brutality, but in demonstrating fundamental human depravity. The honeybees in Thessalie's apiary continued their work, oblivious to human drama. Volunteers maintained the hives, harvesting honey each season. Hive number 8, source of the bee that solved the case, remained productive. Each spring when the corpse lily bloomed, volunteers would pause and remember a woman who'd found peace in the ordered society of her hives, and whose life had been ended by the son who should have been her greatest source of pride. The case file eventually filled 23 archive boxes containing 847 pages of forensic reports, thousands of pages of testimony, exhibits ranging from a single dead bee to a 23-page manifesto. The bee, properly preserved in the evidence locker, remained available for any appeals requiring re-examination. It was a tiny remnant of a life once lived, an insect that died doing what evolution designed it to do, inadvertently becoming the key that unlocked justice. In the end, the case stood as testament to multiple truths about modern American society, that justice could still be achieved through careful investigation and scientific evidence, that families could be torn apart by ideologies absorbed in the internet's darkest corners, that the price of parental love could be testifying against one's own child, and that some crimes were so calculated and brutal that even youth couldn't serve as excuse. Judge Teosopo's words, "The worst case I've seen," echoed not just in the courthouse, but in broader understanding of how far online radicalization could take a vulnerable mind and how completely it could destroy the people who should have been loved most. The death sentence represented society's ultimate declaration that Breck Miller's actions had placed him beyond redemption, that some betrayals were so fundamental they warranted the most severe punishment the law allowed. And through it all, a single honeybee, crushed, preserved, analyzed, stood as silent witness to the truth that no alibi, no matter how carefully constructed, could ultimately conceal.